title of the message today really has to do with where we end up in chapter 24. Just call it the Sinai covenant ratified. The Sinai covenant ratified. So that's where we're headed. We've been talking about this covenant. We read, last time I spoke, we were considering these 10 words of the covenant, these 10 commandments as we know them today, and how that was kind of this essential covenant document. And we're going to read some more about that and things leading up to then that covenant being ratified. And that's what happens then in Exodus chapter 20, verses 22, where we will begin all the way down to the end of chapter 24. So with that, why don't we pray, seek the Lord's help today. Heavenly Father, we've gathered together here again to be encouraged and edified, to learn. We pray that your word would be made clear. We'd see things here in fresh ways, maybe things we hadn't seen before. We want to draw near to you. We want to know you, appreciate who you are and all that you've done. And surely this incredible scene and episode here, this manifestation of God before the people of Israel, has much to say to us. And so I pray that we would be careful to hear. We might be changed. We pray these things for the sake, the honor, and the completion of the work of Jesus Christ in our lives. Amen. Well, we have another very important section in the book of Exodus in the history of Israel. We are still at Mount Sinai, and the Israelites have not yet received the stone tablets of the covenant, though the words of those that will be on those stone tablets have been spoken to them in a fury of smoke and fire and lightning and thunder and an earthquake in those 10 words of the covenant. It was quite a scene, what we saw last time. Again, God wanted all the people of Israel gathered together at the foot of the mountain, where he was going to come to the top of the mountain, and fire and smoke, thunder, lightning, earthquake, and he would proclaim in a loud voice his covenant requirements to the people, the 10 words of the covenant. It was a terrifying scene and an awesome one. There was a sense in which God wanted the people to be terrified of the display and to greatly fear and have this sight, this scene, as it were, marked in their minds forever, that they might not sin against God. And there was also a sense in which the glory of it was meant to draw their hearts toward him in wonder and praise, and a desire to know him more fully. And so the warnings about not coming near the mountain, lest the people break in to see the Lord. But the people only feared. They didn't seem to want to come see God. They were just greatly afraid. They were afraid of his power, speaking from the midst of the fire. And you can imagine there would be good reason for that. And instead of being drawn out in love and wonder and awe, they shrunk back in fear of being harmed by God. His words, his commands were somewhat terrifying. Imagine you were an adulterous thief and had lied to your neighbor about it, and God says, these are the things which will end the covenant. You just shrink back. You just go back and say, let's just not hear from God anymore. Can we change the scene, the way we get our laws? Moses, can you just go talk to God for us and you let us know what he wants done? That seems like a better idea to them. And in some ways, God saw the same. He wasn't out there to try to make them afraid of him, but to make them fearful of him in terms of a great king, not as a God who was threatening to kill them now. So Moses reassured them they need not fear God in that sense, but rather, again, the display was to make the whole scene very solemn for them. They would have a lasting weight about these laws and commandments as they thought of them in their minds. They wouldn't sin against God in the days and years ahead. He had issued 10 commands, or 8 prohibitions and 2 commands, and he established a sign of this covenant in that document as one of the commands, the sign of the Sabbath. These things were declared directly to the people in a way that brought them terror and fear and made them flee from the mountain to what they considered to be a safer distance. Now, having made that declaration of his covenant, having done that, God having done that, having spoken directly to the people from heaven, God now begins to speak again to them through Moses as the people have asked. And that's where our text picks up today. So in Exodus chapter 20, verse 22, through the end of that chapter, 22 through 26, we have kind of its own unique little section. And here's what I mean. We pick up again in verse 22, and the Lord said to Moses. So God begins speaking again. And I don't know if you have a heading, but I have a heading that says laws about altars. And then at the beginning of chapter 21, laws about slaves. And you may have different headings. But we have all these various headings. And my Bible does present these 7 verses as a different heading. But it's not just laws. These verses in 22 through 26 aren't really laws. There's some things said about altars, but it's not so much about that, and we'll get into that in a moment. But as God begins to speak again, I want you to think of this in the narrative. God says he's been declaring his 10 words of the covenant. The people are terrified. They leave, said, we don't want to hear from God anymore. We want to hear from Moses. God begins then to speak to Moses, and before he gives him all these further laws, he makes some application and interprets for them, defines what the implications ought to be in their minds about the fact that God came and spoke to them directly on the mountain. He says, verse 22, and the Lord said to Moses, thus you shall say to the people of Israel, you have seen for yourselves that I have talked with you from heaven. And then everything else that follows is kind of a therefore, these things are true. This is what I expect from you. And then in chapter 21, he begins, now these are the rules that you shall set before them. So 22 through 26 aren't really part of those lists of rules. They're kind of something else that follows from the fact that God spoke directly to the people in this way. And they're kind of confronting common ideas about idolatry and the way that works, the way people kind of relate to their God. And God's not to be related that way at all. And that's what this first section is about. So I have this first heading kind of as God's application of having spoken to the Israelites from heaven, right? And we could all be thankful for this. Like if some event happens in your life, and you wonder, what should I learn from that? It'd be very helpful for God to come to you and say, now that that happened, therefore, these are the things you should take from that. And this is essentially what God is doing for them here. And so we ought to really focus in. What is it they're supposed to do? So I also want to slow down a little bit for these 7 verses in ways that we might not through some of these other chapters and ask ourselves that question. What are the applications? Well, the first thing, let's look at verse 23. You shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourselves gods of gold. You think, didn't he already prohibit that in the 10 words of the covenant? He did, but here there's application. The fact that I came and spoke to you means you shouldn't do this. The idea is this: no gods of silver to be with me, no gods of gold. The idea of these idols in the ancient religion is that the idols themselves, no one thought the idol was the god, but they were images of the gods. But God had not appeared to them in an image. He was just in this cloud and this fire, and it wasn't an image. It wasn't this kind of an animal or a bird or anything like that. It wasn't an image. Therefore, they were not to use images in the worship of God. The second thing, though, is that idol images of the various gods were thought to contain the presence of the god. They weren't thought to be the God, but somehow that God is manifesting his presence through that idol. And so that's just how they thought of them. So if you could get a priest to make it work, then and you fashion this idol, and you could get a priest to kind of say all the right words and do the right things, then somehow, and this is why you would go to a priest, because you wanted your idol to have some sort of a manifestation of the power and the person of that God that it represented. Well, there was no such conjuring needed with the people of Israel because God had spoken to the people directly from heaven himself. You don't need to fashion an idol in the image of God and get a priest to kind of do his magic spell with it and do all the right things and please the God, that the God would be pleased to kind of manifest himself in this idol, and now you can take the idol home with you and you can have the God dwell with you. They don't need that. God came to them and spoke to them directly on the mountain. There's no need in the worship of God for these idols. None whatsoever. I have spoken, you have seen for yourselves that I have talked with you from heaven. You shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourselves gods of gold. There's no need for that. He already was present with them, and his presence was not mediated to them through any idol. He was on the mountain declaring directly to them his covenant. And then what else do you find here? The next verse. An altar of earth you shall make for me, and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. So you see the context, like again, you don't need these idols to get me there. Don't do that. And as far as an altar, you don't need to fashion your altar and make it, of gold and silver and all these wonderful things. That's not how I came. When I came to you, I just came there up on the mountain and came to you. And so when you're going to make an altar to me where you're going to offer me things, don't make it fancy. You don't need to do all these things. It just can be just a bare altar. Just make it of earth. I'll come. And he says even, in every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and I'll bless you. You see, you don't need the idols. You don't need this kind of an altar. I'm going to come. You see, it's wonderfully reassuring to them. He means to be with them. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. And if you make to me, if you say, okay, we got to use earthen things, so what are we going to make? If we're going to make an altar where we can offer to God. Well, if you decide to make it, right, if you make it an altar of stone, and of course they do, if you make it for me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stones, for if you wield your tool on it, you profane it. I don't even want you to carve and cut the stones. Find good stones and stack them. But this thing about making your offering acceptable to me and me coming to accept it is not about you fashioning this thing a certain way. You don't need any carvings on the stone, no special writing, no etchings, you don't need to be carved a certain way and cut just so. It's not how it's going to be. I will come. If you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stones, for if you wield your tool on it, you profane it. You profane it? That sounds amazing. Like, how could your efforts to make this thing just special that God would be pleased to visit you be profane to God? Because you doing this thing to get God to visit you isn't how this thing started. Right? God didn't come to them because they were more numerous than the others or because they were better people. They were worse. God chose them as His nation, and He chose to enter into covenant with them, not because they deserved anything or they were so pleasing to Him or He saw they were better craftsmen than others and He wanted a beautiful place to be worshipped. That's not how this worked. He just came to them. And none of these things that they can do to somehow invite it, to somehow earn a right of God's visit are to be involved in His worship. And an altar for Him. No such conjuring needed with the people of Israel. No magic idols needed. No special carvings. No special stone. No special craftsman. God was there with them already directly, speaking to them. What else? He says, verse 26, this one sounds for most of us a little bit strange, but, and you shall not go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness be not exposed on it. And you think, what in the world? Well, most of us have, I don't think any of us have, maybe one person has a dress on, 2 people, but 3 people. I can't count very well. All right, so if you got these guys walking up the altar and it's some big altar and there's all these steps on it and everybody's wearing, things that just go down to their knees whenever they start walking up, people down on the ground, what do they see? They see their naked body up underneath their clothes. We don't want that. And you think, well, why is that a law in here? That just seems strange, right? Well, because people wore different clothes than we do now. Like we don't do that, That's one thing. But two, like, why would that matter so much? Well, because people tended to build the altar up high and that kind of thing. And evidently God didn't want any part of worshiping him to be associated with that kind of a lewdness. You think, well, it wouldn't be lewd. It's like, well, yeah, kind of tends to that. But when you also connect it with the kinds of things that were going on in the worship of false gods, then you begin to realize that most of these false gods, they had with them temple prostitutes. Where within the temple and at the altars and things, you would say, this is a god of fertility, and one of the things we do with this god is, you married men, I know you don't want to break covenant with your wives, but you can come worship God and pay an offering to God. And here's a prostitute here. And there at the altar over there, you can go enjoy her. And that's what she's for. And she's it's an offering to God. Then you can go home and feel like you're just a religious man. This is the kind of thing that was going on, and it's common in the ancient world. None of that is allowed. You're not even when you think about the vision from God, or this scene here, when God appears on the mountain, when he spoke from heaven, it was a scene of awe and wonder and holy fear. In no way was the service of God connected to sexual rituals and temple prostitutions that were so common among the false gods. God took no pleasure in such lewd and base ritual practices. Such things were not to be in any way associated with his appearance to the people. Therefore, an abundance of caution must be taken to ensure all such things were removed from any sort of an altar that might be built for him. There must not even be a hint of the nakedness and lewdness associated with the worship of so many false gods. And that's where this is coming from. It all is based on the scene where God spoke the Ten Commandments. Therefore, you have seen for yourselves that I have talked with you from heaven. And then these commands about his worship. And then come in chapter 21. Now these are the rules that you shall set before them. You see, so all this that we've read so far is just the therefore. Because God speaks in this way, we ought not worship him in these other ways. Now, moving on, chapter 21. Right? These are the rules that you shall set before them. We're talking now about the words and the laws of the Lord. Chapter 21, verse 1, all the way to the end of chapter 23. So 21, 22, and 23. As we begin reading these laws, before we dive in, some of them will seem crude to you. They just will. Others will seem wonderful and just and wise. And I want to make some explanation for that at the beginning. I have a few points here. The first thing to say, as a broad category of some of the points I'm going to make, is you have to remember the historical setting of this covenant. First, we're dealing with an ancient culture and an ancient people. Times are harder, much more severe. Most people are simply living hand to mouth. It's just a different era. Nothing's going in the microwave oven. Nothing's going in the oven. Your electric oven, your gas oven. You can forget it. That's not how it's happening. And, what we would consider poverty, they would consider the lap of luxury. So you just got to understand. The idea of knowing already that you can have food for next week, let alone tomorrow, is quite the luxury. It's rare. So that's one thing. Just understand that it's a much different era than we are in today. Second, we're dealing with the same people who were having so many disputes that Moses could do nothing but hear their disputes day after day. And so these laws are setting forth God's expectations for various situations that they will find themselves in. Remember, again, the situation was that, Moses was spending all day having to make these judgments, and the idea was if we could set people up under, thousands and hundreds and fifties and tens, and they could judge, then they could only bring Moses the hard cases. And now they have these laws from God, and now that's a written code, and those men can look and interpret and apply that law. And so a lot of it is case study. If this kind of thing happens, or this guy does this to that person, and then they have this, then this is what you should do. And we look at it, and we don't have any of that in our culture. We just try to figure out, well, how might that apply? And really, that's not a bad question to ask, how might that apply? But the immediate question is, what's the nature of justice being worked out in that situation? And we want to try to understand that before we jump to application. And so a lot of this is just dealing with their current practices and those kinds of things and how they should govern themselves. Again, this is a covenant primarily about God saying, I'm going to be your king, and if I'm going to rule over you, there are certain things I'm going to require of you. You're going to have to be different than other people in these ways. The third thing I want to say is we ought to understand that these laws are written for a hard-hearted people. They are not designed to be an expression of God's perfect ideas of how people ought to treat one another. And this is a hard one to get your head around at first if you haven't thought about it before. But let's just turn to Matthew chapter 19 to get a basic understanding of this. I know this will be familiar to many of you, but in Matthew chapter 19 is a very important passage for understanding this point. Matthew 19, verses 7 through 8. Pharisees come up to Jesus and they begin to test him about divorce. They want to try to get him to make a judgment here, and they're going to pounce on him with what he says. And in the context of the dispute, Jesus says, look, it's not allowed. And they say, well, look at verse 7. They said to him, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and send her away? Right, if you're displeased with your wife. He said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. And so you have here, you can see clearly, there is this thing that an expectation of God, a demand of God, which exists from the beginning, which is always applicable to all people. But then there's this law of Moses, which didn't legislate that behavior. Even though God, if you were to ask God his opinion on the matter, he would tell you that is wrong. You don't just get to send your wife away for any reason. Moses allowed it. So Moses' law wasn't as high of a standard as this law of God regarding marriage. And I just say that's that way for many of these things. It's a law that's given not to be the perfect expression of the will of God, but rather to be a governing law for a nation of people, mostly unregenerate, mostly who turn away from God, but to keep them as a nation preserved, distinct from the people around them, until this promised seed would come, right? Who would come from their lineage. Fourth, these laws often call the people of Israel to a higher manner of living, but often there are practices allowed that are merely regulated in a merciful way. So sometimes it calls them to live very high, and other times it's like takes this bad thing that they're doing and just regulates it, makes it less bad. Because while God is concerned to begin teaching this people about justice, he's also seeking again to preserve them. God is not seeking to convert and make all the hearts new of every Israelite in the nation of Israel here. He just doesn't do that. That's something that exists, that happens later, but it's not something that happens here. Fifth thing, when God speaks about the righteousness of his law, you find elsewhere in the Bible he talks about how no one has a law like this is such a righteous law. Understand, again, he's not speaking about this law as it reflects the very righteousness of heaven, but rather that it far surpasses anything that existed at the time. There was no other nation that had a law as righteous as these laws, as a body of laws. It's not that there was never any law in any nation that wasn't maybe equally as good as any of the Israelite laws, but as a body of law, this law was just higher and superior. So when God gave a nation a law to govern them on this earth, he gave them a law that was better than any other nation had. Far better. And it was good for them for that time until the seed would come, and then it was served its purpose. This isn't a law, we shouldn't be looking to the old covenant laws as, how should America be run? These aren't laws for us. We can learn a lot about what God thinks of certain institutions and certain practices and things by reading these laws. We can learn a lot about God. But that's not what this is. This is a covenant between God and the people of Israel from Moses to Christ. And that's who it's supposed to govern. So it's less than a perfect law code. It has allowances for hard-hearted people. It allows sinful practices in some ways to continue and persist, and regulates them instead of eliminating them. But at the same time, it teaches a tremendous amount about righteousness and love and devotion and dedication to God. It does all of those things. It's perfect for God's purpose, but it may be not perfect for what purpose you want to assign to it. For God's purpose, it was perfect. It might not be perfect for whatever ideas you have to use it for. I could say this too, last point on this. If we want God to give us a perfect code of law, if you say, why can't God just give us a perfect explanation of what He wants? Well, He's done so in the person of Jesus Christ. You have to wait until Christ to find that. And in the Lord Jesus Christ, you will find this perfect code. In Him we find our great example, the Son, in whom the Father is well pleased. He's the exact representation of the Father's nature, the very image of the invisible God. To have seen Him and heard Him is to have seen and heard the Father. He's perfect. So, if you want to know exactly what God commands, what would God expect? Go learn of Christ. All right, so what sorts of laws does God begin to give the people? It's an odd thing, right? I think given the qualifications I've given, we're braced for it. But you wouldn't think, coming off the Ten Commandments, God would say, okay, now, concerning slaves. You just think, what? Like we're going to lead off with how we treat slaves and how we buy them and these kind of things. Like, it just seems like a big letdown. But again, understanding the situation and the purpose of the law, it's perfectly fine. It makes perfect sense. Now, these are the rules that you shall set before them. When you buy a Hebrew slave, not any slave, but a Hebrew, a fellow countryman, an Israelite slave, he shall serve 6 years, and the seventh he shall go out free for nothing. And we hear that and think, oh, there's slavery. And we ought to be, if we were someone of their era, we just said, 6 years is all I get to keep a slave? And I got to let him go? How am I ever going to get paid? This is an outrage, right? But if you're owing money, you're thinking, only 6 years and I'm out. It's glorious. This doesn't exist. This exists because God gave it as a command to the people of Israel, and it exists in their culture if they practice it. But it's His rule. He shall go out free. What's the last two words say? Of that verse 2, he shall go out free without payment or for nothing. So if he owes you 60 years worth of labor and he's got to sell himself to you as a slave, you get out of him all you can for 6, and on the 7th year, he's out of there. But later we'll learn that these 7 years were actually on cycles, so it's not 6 years from when he became a slave. It's 6 years from the last year of Jubilee, so he might only have 2 years left. And he's out of there, free for nothing. It's incredible. What a provision for the poor. You just can't imagine. What else? Let's keep reading. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. You think, what? Okay, keep going. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her masters, and he shall go out alone. And you think, this is awful. Now a guy comes in as a single slave, and he's just a slave, and you say, hey, I bought this other slave, and I'm going to give her to you to be with as a wife, and I want you to make me kids. Why? Because universally, kids born in slavery were slaves. I want more slaves. And afterwards, later it's time for that man to go free, he doesn't get to take her with him. Or those kids. They're your property. And you think, how can this be? How can God speak? He's not affirming any of this. He's saying, this is the practice, but this is what is commonly done, but I'm going to regulate it. You're not allowed to just do it in this way. What does he say? If the slave plainly says, I love my master and my wife and my children, the slave thinks of them as belonging to him. They love one another. You don't get to send that slave away. He's allowed to stay. But to make it all clear, he's got to go and he's got to make this oath, and all these things happen. He says, if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, he will not go out. I will not go out free. Then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door of the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall be a slave forever. You think, well, that's still awful bad. Yeah, but it wasn't. You weren't required to leave your family, which was often done. I mean, again, it's like, as bad as this sounds, think about without that law. Think about how much worse it is if that doesn't exist. And these slaves are not even Hebrew slaves. These are like foreign slaves. The Hebrew slave, you couldn't even do those things. Verse 7, when a man, wrap your mind around this, when a man does this, because men do this all the time, when a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. So here's a man, he owes all this debt, he's got to pay it. When he sells his daughter, you think, what? What do you mean when he sells his daughter? She doesn't go out like when he sells a son. When you sell a son, he just goes out and he's off on his own. But a daughter, not so. We're going to regulate that. There are certain practices we want in place, mercies for her that don't exist elsewhere in the world. What are the mercies? If she does not please her master, who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. All right, we'll read some more things in a minute, but let me explain here. The idea is this: you've had a mountain of debt, and we tend to think that's such a bad thing for that man to sell his daughter. But let's just understand this: there was an expectation for marriage later. That's the idea. Maybe your daughter is 7; she's not ready to be married. But you owe this debt, and it's crushing your family, and you guys aren't going to eat tomorrow or the next week or anything else unless something radical happens. And you owe a lot of money to this man, but he seems generally be a decent man. Would he be willing, he's a young man, he's not married yet, would he be willing to pay, to forgive your debt, take your daughter in, provide for her, and then she would have to become his wife? That sounds terrible to us. But this is what's... So this would often happen. A man would be forced to this. But then, what happens if the man who she's supposed to marry just says, I don't really want to marry her, and he gets rid of her? And now you still owe the debt, and you've had your daughter in this whole situation all this time. It's terrible. Well, here, if he decides, if he does not please her master who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. Let her go back. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people. That would happen. Sure, you can sell me your daughter, I'll marry her, and then he turns around, and he sells her to some foreigner, and it's off in another country, and you can't have no way to get her back. No, you're allowed to redeem her. It's a limit on the wickedness that was going on. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has broken faith with her. The agreement was that she was going to eventually be his bride. If he designates her for her son, so now it wasn't ever going to be for him, it was going to be for her son, or his son, he shall deal with her as with a daughter. So she comes in, and as a slave, and he's got a couple years until his son is ready to marry. How does he treat her in the meantime? As a daughter. Not as a slave, as a daughter. Because what? She's going to be a daughter to him when she marries, and he's to begin treating her that way now. That's a much better situation, right? So if you're a dad and you're gonna do this kind of thing, don't do it. But if you're forced to this is so much better than the other things that would happen. If he takes another wife to himself, so now he's bought her as a slave, but maybe he just views her as she's my wife, but she was a slave. This other woman, like, I'm really attracted to her, and I'd like to have her as my wife, and he marries her as well. If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, and her marital rights. She's still fully a wife. He doesn't get to say, well, but that was just a slave arrangement. I don't really treat her like a wife. No. Like, if you're going to take another wife, you darn sure don't get to diminish her. That's incredible. After all, she was just a slave. And if he does not do these three things, or if he fails her in any of these three things, she shall get to go out for nothing without payment of money. She's totally free. Debt's forgiven if he doesn't do what he's supposed to do in these ways. Now again, these are we would love to see that these things weren't even allowed, but they were common practice. They existed everywhere in the ancient world. Just think about Rome. There were more people in Rome. I think they say Rome was 2/3 slaves. Think of that. Like this, as much as we just think, oh, that's terrible that ever happened, it was universally practiced. And here we have laws that are more noble and better than anywhere else in the world at the time. Verse 12. Okay, so that's the first 11 verses, is laws about slaves. I also wanted to say this. Politicians often say things like, people are having to choose between buying medicine and buying food, or buying food and paying for heat. But imagine deciding between selling yourself into slavery or selling your daughter into slavery in order to provide for food for the next few months for the rest of the family. I think most of us, we just as men want to say, well, I would never sell my daughter. But hold on. If you sell yourself, who will provide for the family when the money runs out next month? I don't know. If you sell your son, he won't fetch as much money, and there's no real security for him. But if you sell your daughter, unspeakably bad things might happen to her. But perhaps you can find someone who gives you reason to think they would marry her and make a wife of her in time and give her to their, or maybe give her to their son as a wife. Well, that seems like a far better option. And these laws allowed for that to be an option, when most of the time it wasn't. Again, it's crushing to think how hard things were. But these laws dealt with a crude and hard institution, one which still exists in many parts of the world, but it puts a tremendous limit to the nature of these exchanges and how these things work. Now, verses 12 through 32, I feel like are all about laws dealing with personal injury. Someone injured another person or injured your animal, that kind of thing. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. I will read it and then make one comment, but it's a quote from a commentary from years and years ago, but I'll read that here in a moment. So let's just read these verses. Whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death, but if he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place to which he may flee. But if a man willfully attacks another to kill him by cunning, you shall take him from my altar that he may die. Whoever strikes his father or his mother shall be put to death. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. Whoever curses his father or his mother shall be put to death. When men quarrel, and one strikes another with a stone or with his fist, and the man does not die, but takes to his bed, then if the man rises again and walks outdoors with a staff, he who struck him shall be clear. Only he shall pay for the loss of his time, and he shall have him thoroughly healed. When a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. The idea there is the owner of the slave is suffering the loss of beating that slave. He beat him. He didn't kill him right then. The guy lives for a little while, and then he died. It's like, man, one, it's evidently not as severe of a beating, is the idea. And two, the loss of that slave is a loss to that man. Like, again, in other words, typically, you owe me, 10,000 shekels, and I take this guy, these 3 slaves as payment, and then they die a week later. Or how am I getting my value of my money? I lost it all. And that's the idea here. The slave is his money. Verse 22, when men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, there is no harm. The one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. When a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free because of his tooth. When an ox gores a man or a woman to death, and the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall not be liable. But if the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned, but has not kept it in, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner also shall be put to death. If a ransom is imposed on him, then he shall give for the redemption of his life whatever is imposed on him. If it gores a man's son or daughter, he shall be dealt with according to this same rule. If the ox gores a slave, male or female, the owner shall give to their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. Some of these laws about the slaves, as we read them, you just think, what? Like if the slave dies, is his property, and that kind of thing. How many of you have ever read or heard or seen performed or heard Shakespeare's play, The Merchant of Venice? Anyone? 1, 2, 3. Okay, so maybe I'm in the wrong crowd. All right, but so there is this pound of flesh that is to be had, right? And in payment for a debt. And what's the guy's name? The Jew who wants the Shylock. Yeah. So he wants this pound of flesh, and he seeks to take it. He's allowed to take it from whatever he wants, and he wants the man's heart. I'll take my pound of flesh from the heart. And everyone's worried because like all the laws are such set up, and the agreement is such that it seems like ironclad. He's going to get to kill this guy. But then somebody carefully reads and says, but it doesn't say anything about making him bleed. So you can't draw any blood. And I feel like it's kind of that way with some of these laws about slaves. It's like, if you beat him so that he dies, he'll be avenged. But if you beat him and he survives a few days, then that's, you've suffered, you lost your investment, so that's enough. The slave is your money. And then a few verses later, now if you beat a slave and you mess up his eye, you have to let him go. And if you mess up, even if he loses a tooth, you have to let him go free. So it's like, well, how much are you allowed to do? Like you just don't hit him in the head, I guess? Like beat him elsewhere? I mean, it's kind of a strange thing. Like, and then it talks about, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and stripe for stripe, the way of avenging people. And so there's a real sense in which there are limits to this. It's more than just to think, well, since I have a slave, I can do whatever. It's like, yeah, except if he loses a tooth, he's gone. You could have him serve you for 20 years, or if he's a Hebrew for maybe 6, and then go out, or you can lose him after a week because you hit him in the face. Like, that's not a good idea. And so just understand that these laws, even when we read the ones that sound, like they allow a whole lot, when put with some of the others, maybe don't allow what you think. And anyway, so that's there. Now, what I was going to say about this, as far as, let's see where we're at here. Oh, sorry, no, that's all I wanted to say on those. Now let's go down to the next section. That's where I've got this quote. Verses 33 of chapter 21 all the way to about the middle of chapter 22. Laws about protection of property. Protecting personal property, your personal property. Verse 33. When a man opens a pit, or when a man digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restoration. He shall give money to its owner, and the dead beast shall be his. When one man's ox butts another's so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and share its price, and the dead beast also they shall share. Or if it is known that the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has not kept it in, he shall repay ox for ox, and the dead beast shall be his. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and kills it or sells it, he shall repay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. If you hear that? If a man steals an ox or a sheep and kills it or sells it, he shall repay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. If a thief is found breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there should be no blood guilt for him. Right? So if you break into somebody's property, and we'll read at night, and you die, the people kill you, fair game. That's on you. But if the sun has risen on him, there shall be blood guilt for him. The idea there is that it couldn't have been an accident. It could have been you were just so terrified. You knew where he was. You could see what was going on. You could shoo him away maybe. Now, if there was a struggle, that's different. But like just the fact that he broke in, if it's daytime, doesn't mean you have a right to kill him. Nighttime, hey, you can kill him. No problem. But it's daytime, the police officers might ask questions. But at nighttime, no questions need to be asked. Just we'll zip up the body and take him. Thank you, sir. Sorry for your trouble. So that's the idea, right? Okay? All right, now, if the sun has risen on him, there shall be blood guilt for him. He shall surely pay. If he has nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. If the stolen, or you got that? So if you go in and try to steal something from your neighbor, you got to pay for it. But if you can't pay, we'll sell you into slavery. You got to pay for what you tried to steal. If the stolen beast then later is found alive and in his possession, whether it's an ox or a donkey or a sheep, he shall pay double. If a man causes a field or a vineyard to be grazed over, or lets his beast loose and it feeds in another man's field, he shall make restitution from the best in his own field and in his own vineyard. If fire breaks out and catches in thorns so that the stacked grain or the standing grain or the field is consumed, he who started the fire shall make full restitution. If a man gives to his neighbor money or goods to keep safe, and it is stolen from the man's house, then if the thief is found, he shall pay double. If the thief is not found, the owner of the house shall come near to God to show whether or not he has put his hand on his neighbor's property. For every breach of trust, whether it is for an ox, for a donkey, for a sheep, for a cloak, or for any kind of lost thing, of which one says, "This is it," the case of both parties shall come before God. The one whom God condemns shall pay double to his neighbor. If a man gives to his neighbor a donkey or an ox or a sheep or any beast to keep safe, and it dies, or it is injured, or is driven away without anyone seeing it, an oath by the Lord shall be between them both to see whether or not he has put his hand to his neighbor's property. The owner shall accept the oath, and he shall not make restitution. But if it is stolen from him, he shall make restitution to its owner. If it is torn by beasts, let him bring it as evidence. He shall not make restitution for what has been torn. If a man borrows anything of his neighbor, and it is injured or dies, the owner not being with it, he shall make full restitution. If the owner was with it, he shall not make restitution. If it was hired, it came for its hiring fee. Right? Now, we could go in and try to explain all those kinds of things. I think a lot of them are pretty self-explanatory, but we're not going to try to do that. I want to highlight for you a little bit here what this old commentary said on this. And it's one of those where it was a quote from a quote from a quote, so I couldn't even tell you the original guy, but I just want to read it. This bit about the thief, that early on section, those first 4 verses, he says, "This is the only way of getting a thief. You cannot reason with him. He dismissed his reason before he committed his felony. He had first to strangle his reason. He committed murder in the sanctuary of his soul before he committed theft in the fields of his neighbor. What then is to be done with him? Well, he must be made to feel the folly of theft. He must be made to feel that theft is a bad investment. He must be made to feel that he has played the fool, even in the excess of his cleverness. The thief would be made to know what dishonesty is, when for the one ox he must pay 5 in its place. He could have evaded an argument. He could have doubled upon a covenant and have quibbled about the ambiguity of its terms, but he could not shuffle out of this 4-square arithmetic arrangement. 5 oxen for an ox, 4 sheep for a sheep, and by the time the thief had played at this game 2 or 3 days, he would put on the garb, at least, the clothing at least, of an honest man." So that's what and it's pretty colorful the way he describes it. Now, chapter 22, verses 16 down to 23:9, I think laws about social responsibility. Let's read those. These would be laws that have to do with maintaining a social order and an environment in the public sphere. Think about just the kind of the public atmosphere when these things are law. If a man seduces a virgin who is engaged to be married, or betrothed rather, and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. So that is, she's betrothed to him, but he's lies with her before the time. He has to pay the bride price for her and make her his wife. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he would have that right, the father would. He shall pay money equal to the bride price for virgins and still not get the woman. That's amazing. You shall not permit a sorceress to live. Whoever lies with an animal shall be put to death. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destruction. You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows and your children fatherless. That's a threat. Man, how do you treat the widow and the fatherless child? If you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor, you shall not be like a money lender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. If ever you take your neighbor's cloak in pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down, for that is his only covering, and it is his cloak for his body. And what else shall he sleep? And if he cries to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. Right? If you not, I am. You shall not revile God, nor curse the ruler of your people. You shall not delay to offer from the fullness of your harvest and from the outflow of your presses. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. You shall do the same with your oxen and with your sheep. 7 days it shall be with its mother. On the 8th day you shall give it to me. You shall be consecrated to me. Therefore you shall not eat any flesh that is torn by beasts in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs. You shall not spread a false report. You shall not join hands with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. You shall not fall in with the many to do evil, nor shall you bear witness in a lawsuit, siding with the many so as to pervert justice. Nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his lawsuit. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall bring it back to him. Even your enemy, you bring it back. If you see the donkey of the one who hates you lying down under its burden, you shall refrain from leaving him with it. You shall rescue it with him. You shall not pervert the justice due to your poor in his lawsuit. Keep far from a false charge, and do not kill the innocent and righteous. For I will not acquit the wicked. And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of those who are in the right. You shall not oppress a sojourner. You know the heart of a sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. Laws about social responsibility. What else? Verses 10 through 19. Laws about the Sabbath and annual festivals. For 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield. But the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat. And what they leave, the beasts of the field may eat. You shall do likewise with your vineyard and with your olive orchard. So we learn about not just the Sabbath days, but Sabbath years, right? Every 7th year you weren't allowed to even plant or do anything to your field. Just the poor were allowed to come in. You weren't allowed to get anything out of there, but poor people could come in, animals could get in, whatever. You were supposed to trust that God provided for you in the first 6 years. You didn't have to do anything the 7th year. And then also the Sabbath days, verse 12. 6 days you shall do your work, but on the 7th day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and the son of your servant woman and the alien may be refreshed. Right? Verse 13. Pay attention to all that I have said to you, and make no mention of the names of other gods, nor let it be heard on your lips. And then these feasts. 3 times in the year you shall keep a feast to me. You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread, as I commanded you. You shall eat unleavened bread for 7 days at the appointed time in the month of Abib, for in it you came out of Egypt. None shall appear before me empty-handed. You shall keep the feast of harvest, of the firstfruits of your labor, of what you sow in the field. You shall keep the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather in from the field the fruit of your labor. 3 times in the year shall all your males appear before the Lord. You shall not offer... we're still going. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with anything leavened, or let the fat of my feast remain until the morning. The best of the first fruits of your ground you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Laws about Sabbath and annual feasts, right? This is what we're reading about. There's a lot there to say there. We could, maybe if you have questions at the end, we can talk about some of those verses that are a little bit curious, but straightforward there about what's supposed to be done. Then we have these 2 remaining sections which are very different. The rest of chapter 23 is words about God's angel and sort of conditions for conquest. Or really what we find is 3 warnings and 2 blessings, and they alternate. A warning, a blessing, a warning, a blessing, a warning. And so we'll just see that in a moment. I also want to mention, he says in verse 20, Behold, I send an angel before you to guard you on the way and to bring you to the place that I have prepared. This angel that was going to go before. We often think of God saying, I was the one going before you, and he was, and he speaks that way. But in Exodus chapter 33, he actually threatens and says, I won't go, I'll merely send an angel. And the people say, no, we need you to come too. And so they're not mutually exclusive, but evidently God is there, but also God is there and also with this angel. And he says, I send an angel before you to guard you on the way and to bring you to the place that I have prepared. So there's an agent. God's doing it. He's also using an agent, this angel, and then you have the people. And the angel's going to go there and he's going to make it safe for them. He says this warning, verses 20 and 21, right? I'm going to send this angel. Verse 21, pay careful attention to him and obey his voice. Do not rebel against him, for he will not pardon your transgression, for my name is in him. Right? He has my authority to do these things, and he's not going to say, oh, it's okay. It's like, no, he has authority to do this, and if you sin against him, you're going to pay for it. Do not rebel against him. There's this warning. Then in verse 22 and 23, there's this blessing. But if you carefully obey his voice and do all that I say, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. When my angel goes before you and brings you to the Amorites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Canaanites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, and I blot them out. Right? He's going to blot them out. That's huge. Now another warning, verses 24 and 25. You shall not bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do as they do. But you shall utterly overthrow them and break their pillars in pieces. You shall serve the Lord your God. And then we have blessings. And he will bless your bread and your water, and I will take sickness away from among you. None shall miscarry or be barren in your land. I will fulfill the number of your days. I will send my terror before you and will throw into confusion all the people against whom you shall come, and will make all your enemies turn their backs to you. And I will send hornets before you, which shall drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, and the Hivites before you. I will not drive them out from you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the wild beasts multiply against you. Little by little I will drive them out from before you, until you have increased and possessed the land. And I will set your border from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, and from the wilderness to the Euphrates, for I will give the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. And then the last warning. You shall make no covenant with them and their gods. They shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. All that is written. Now then, chapter 24, this covenant is confirmed. This book of the covenant is accepted as further terms of the covenant. Now notice I've changed my phrasing now. Instead of the 10 words of the covenant, to this book of the covenant. Let's look for a moment verses 3 and 4 and 7. Verse 3, chapter 24, verse 3. Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words that the Lord has spoken we will do. Verse 4, and Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. And then verse 7, then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. So you had those 10 words, we have the basic covenant, but then you have, again, those things being expanded and elaborated on more, other things being added to it in this book of the covenant. And so this is where, again, there's still the 10 words of the covenant, but now we have more book of the covenant. And then we'll find later there's even more added to it. It's still considered the book of the covenant. And so this is what is ratified. Now, let's look then just through this chapter 24, verse 1. Then he said to Moses, come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar. So he invites, 74 people to come up, right? There's 70 elders plus Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, or maybe those 4 are considered part of the 70 elders, but regardless, 70 or 74 people come up, and they're invited to come up and worship the Lord from afar. Verse 2, Moses alone shall come near to the Lord, but the others shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him. Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules, and all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words that the Lord has spoken we will do. So he just reported to them everything that we've just read. They said, yep, we'll do it all. And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose then early in the morning and built an altar. And this is now we're reading about this ceremony of covenant making, where this covenant is going to be ratified. He rose early in the morning and built an altar. What kind of an altar? An earthen altar with uncut stones, right? He built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the people of Israel who offered, because there was no Levitical priestly tribe yet. So the young men, who would go? Well, the young men who are able and fit to do all this hard work, go send them, because after all, we're a nation of priests, right? As it is right now for them. And so they come, the young men of the people of Israel, who offered burnt offerings and sacrifices and peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins. How many animals were slaughtered? I don't know, half of the blood we took half of the blood and put it in these bowls. And half of the blood he threw against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. He had already just told them all about this. But now this is the official ceremony. Now he reads it in front. They're all there, gathered together. He takes, these animals are slaughtered and all this happens. Half the blood's on the altar, half the blood is in these bowls. He reads the book of the covenant in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. And Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. He may have taken it and thrown it on the people, but if he did, he certainly didn't get all the people. I mean, there's millions of them. He didn't get all of the people with the blood, I can't imagine. I think it's more likely the people have been represented now by the 12 pillars, representing the 12 tribes, and he throws it on the 12 pillars representing all the people that are there. Probably what happens, because it is a ceremony. Does that make sense? Like, I mean, I don't know how long they were there if everyone had to get sprinkled with this blood, and how much blood they had in all these basins, and then Moses certainly didn't do it himself. He sent a bunch of people out to go do it. But I think it's likely that it was done on those pillars representing the 12 tribes. Now, that's the ceremony. This blood of this ceremony makes a solemn and official covenant with God. The 10 words of the covenant, the book of the covenant as it exists now, will exist as further laws are declared, are sworn into ratification by words, by oaths, and by blood. Which means there's a warning of death to any party who doesn't meet up to its conditions. It fixes the duties of each party one to another in a blood covenant. This is the idea. And then you have this most amazing ending of this chapter. Still part of the ceremony. The Lord said to Moses, come up to me on the mountain and wait there, that I may give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandment, which I have written for their instruction. I'm sorry, I skipped here. Verse 9 is where I want to start. Again, still part of the ceremony. Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. So a lot of times when these covenants are made, there's a covenant meal. And Nadab, Abihu, Moses and Aaron, and the 70 elders of Israel get to partake in this covenant meal. It's incredible, right? They have a meal with God. Then they saw the God of Israel. And you think, so it's like, well, what's the description? There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. That's all that they described? It's like if I say, I saw God. I had fellowship with God, and I had to have a meal with him, and I saw him. Well, what was it like? Well, there was, under his feet, there was a pavement of sapphire like stone, and it was like the sky for clearness. And I think the idea is that's all they saw. That's the extent of it. That's the extent of what they saw. And you think, well, okay, they didn't see much, but they saw God. What happened to them? And he did not lay his hand on the chief of men of the people of Israel. He didn't lay hands on them. They're sinners, but he didn't lay hands on them. He let them, this great God who spoke to us those terrifying words from the mountain, he invited them up, had a meal with them. They got to see him in some way. He didn't lay hands on anybody. We really have peace with God. Through this covenant, we can maintain the situation where God will be for us. This is the idea. He did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God and ate and drank. And the Lord said to Moses, come up to me, right, even further up on the mountain, and wait there, that I may give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandment, which I have written for their instruction. And that's, again, part of the ceremony is you get official copies of things to be stored and kept. And Moses had written a copy, but God was going to make copies for them instead, and he's going to do it on stone tablets. So Moses rose with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up into the mountain of God, and he said to the elders, wait here for us until we return to you, and behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a dispute, let him go to them. Like you expect problems while you're gone, so let people go to them. Then Moses went up on the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. The glory of the Lord dwelt on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. On the 7th day he called to Moses out of the midst of the cloud. Now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel. Moses entered the cloud and went up on the mountain, and Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. That's the chapter. And there you have, again, this covenant being ratified. It's such a thing. The people are saying they're going to do these things, and you have this meal. You have the text that's going to be given to them. It's quite a scene. When you think of this covenant terms and God there on the mountain, the fire and the smoke and all this stuff and the declaration, these are the words of the covenant. And this is the arrangement and all these rules and laws that they have. And some of them seemed easy to follow, some of them hard, some of them, those 10 words, hard to follow all of those. And there are all the threatenings that exist and everything else. And it says, if you do this, I'll bless you. And if you fail, these curses will come upon you. Are you not glad that the new covenant isn't like the old covenant? I mean, that God didn't just say, I'll make an agreement with you. You can be mine. If you will do all these things, then, hey, you don't need to worry about all the stuff that happened to the Egyptians. But if you fail, it's all going to come. You think, it's almost like, what kind of a agreement is this? Like, we're not going to make it. And, of course, they didn't. I mean, before Moses even comes down with the tablets, they've already gone off into idolatry. And like the whole history of Israel is just God just patiently forgiving them. And eventually they through the prophets and everything else, eventually they get to the point where they have gone so far, the covenant is over. It's done totally. He finally brings upon them the full force of all the threatenings of breaking covenant. But the blood of Christ is, and the new covenant is not like that old covenant and the blood of the old covenant. It's totally different. And we can be thankful for that. Next time, we'll jump into these laws about the sanctuary and the ark and all this kind of stuff. There will be some helpful things in it. We're taking big sections of things now in Exodus, so we're not as slowed down there as much. But if we're going to do this before 100 messages, this is the way we're going to have to do it. So that's how it is. Are there questions or comments on any of the things we've seen here today? A lot of laws, some obscure ones, some strange ones. Again, my point is to try to get us to understand the flow of thought and what's happening through the chapters more than anything. So, anyone?